please give a big round of applause for Pauline.
Thank you. Thank you. And that was the perfect pronunciation of my last name. Like, very impressive. Yeah, thanks for coming to the last, pick me for the last slot of the day. So my name is Pauline. I'm a senior software engineer at MongoDB, a database company you might well know. And I want to talk to you about why you should be maybe getting paid to write open source software. So sorry, Sarah, you kind of set the expectations in your talk that I was going to maybe talk about like why we should be giving money to people writing open source software. No, this one is for you to tell you why you should be getting paid to write open source software.
Also valid.
Very, as you will see, also pretty valid in my opinion. So I want to start us off with a good old corny show of hands. So raise your hand if you've ever contributed to OSS. That's a lot of hands. That's great. Wait, keep your hand up if any of those contributions were completely unrelated to your day-to-day job. That's pretty good. Okay, now raise your hand. You can put them down, but raise them again if you'd like to contribute or contribute more, but you don't have the time outside of work. That's pretty much the entire room, right? So,
hold on, though. No.
Yeah. Okay. Some people don't count. some people do enough. Yeah. So exactly, it's kind of difficult to get very involved in open source if you have like a full-time job writing proprietary code because of things like maybe you have screen fatigue after a full day, or you have like other responsibilities outside of work, like maybe a family or hobbies or a social life, and yeah, it's not. This is very important also. So it's pretty hard to get into, and that is why I love my job. I love my job, not to boast. Nice sound effect. Okay. Okay. So I love my job. Like I said, my title is senior software engineer at MongoDB, but I think my actual role could best be described as professional open source software maintainer because I get paid to maintain open source software, which I love. And just quick side note. While I'm not here to promote MongoDB, much of this talk will be speaking from my experience at MongoDB because the entire reason I'm giving this talk and the entire subject of this talk is essentially my job. So I am going to talk a little bit about MongoDB because they pay me to write open source software, which is incredible because that's always been my dream since I started, is to get paid to write open source software full time. So I love it. And it's precisely because it's so hard to get into otherwise. And I used to want to get into it a lot more, and I just found it pretty much impossible. And so I think we all know the value of using open source software, right? Like we're all reliant on open source software, whether it be, Composer, or Symfony, Laravel, PHP itself, or operating systems on your phone or your computers. And I feel like we talk a lot about, being appreciative of maintainers, donating to the PHP Foundation and others, donating to maintainers whose projects you use in work to make money. We don't talk about that enough, but we do talk about that quite a bit. But I don't feel like I ever see people talk about the value of paying people to write open source software. And I think also it's more of a blind spot for people on the business side that there is value to expend developer resources to writing open source software. So if you're interested in also getting paid for open source software, this talk is for you, and hopefully by the end of it you'll figure out a way to also get paid to write open source software. So before I get to like the why and the value of paying people to write OSS, I just want to explain a little bit about what my team does. So this is the PHP DBX team in MongoDB. DBX is the department database experience, which basically is responsible for all the tooling and the client libraries and things surrounding the actual database. So we are the PHP team inside of that department. You might be wondering where I am. I'm right here on the screen because this was at SymphonyCon. I was emceeing a track when they took this photo. So thanks for not waiting up. One other teammate is in this room, Rashab. That's Rashab. So that's my product manager. So our team is part of the DBX department, like I said. So we have our database, of course, which has a dedicated team that writes the actual server. But then we also have DBX, and within DBX we have, for every major language, we have a dedicated client libraries team. So we have one for Go, C++, Java, Rust, more than are actually on this slide even. But of course we also have one for PHP. So all of these teams write open source software specifically to facilitate our users to actually use our product. So things like libraries, SDKs, ODMs, stuff like that. So for the PHP team specifically, that means we maintain a few things like the MongoDB PHP extension, which is written in C, and then a slightly higher level PHP library for MongoDB. And then at an even higher abstraction level, we have the Doctrine ODM, which is the kind of favored solution for Symfony, and then the MongoDB Laravel extension, which extends the Laravel Query Builder and the Eloquent Builder, so you can use them with MongoDB. And then aside from that, we also contribute to various other things in the broader ecosystem. So things like Symfony and Laravel Core, and more recently things like Symfony AI and Elephant, which are both Gen AI frameworks for PHP. But I'll get to kind of the broader ecosystem contributions a little bit later. I want to kind of focus on the things that we maintain for a second, because all of the things that we maintain are critical for users to actually use our product. Without these, it would be a much higher barrier of entry for PHP developers specifically to speak to MongoDB, because they'd have to directly speak to it, right? So again, if we didn't have any of these tools, our market share in PHP would just be much smaller. And the same goes, of course, for every other major language. So the most glaring advantage, I think, for the business side, and the most obvious sort of argument you can make for paying people to write open source software, is that the product ecosystem, so the ecosystem surrounding your product, facilitates people to become users, thus increasing your market share. And more users, more better, basically. That's fairly obvious, I would hope. But I want to specifically hone in for the ODM, on the ODM for a second. So the Doctrine ODM is based on the Doctrine ORM, the Object Relational Mapper, which maps PHP classes to columns and tables in your relational database. And so the ODM is the Object Document Mapper, which does the same, but for document-based databases, actually just MongoDB in this specific case. But that is the premise of the ODM, and it's very, very old. I think the first time I used it myself was like 2015, 2016, but it's older than that. So the first commit was made in 2010, and the database itself was first released in 2009. So it's almost as old as the database itself, which after Sarah's talk, I realized that when I say the ODM is very, very old, it's not actually that old. But in relation to our database, it's pretty old. So what happened here is, which is very common, is just a developer had a problem, right? They wanted to use a product and they found no convenient way to do it. So then they started this project. They thought maybe it's useful for someone else, so they put it online on GitHub, and then other people who had the same problem converged to this repo and started using it and contributing to it and things like that, which is great. But the problem is this, that, of course, this was 2010, and over the years, a lot of things happen and change. So, life happens. The original maintainer might no longer really have an incentive to be actively maintaining this thing because it's a lot of work. So they might, have a family or change jobs and not use the database anymore. They might pivot to a career as an alpaca farmer in Scotland or something. So maintainers can fall off. which is not great because things that also can happen are bugs, CVEs, spec changes to your product, like new releases of your product. So if all of those very critical tools that users need to use your product are no longer actively maintained or even abandoned, that means the ecosystem around your product becomes very unreliable, very unstable, which leads to a very frustrating experience for users, which means less users, fewer users. And we just established that more users is more better. So that's a problem. So maintaining this ecosystem yourself ensures reliability and stability, which leads to like increased usage and retained usage and trust of your product, because a trust problem doesn't necessarily have to lie with the product itself. If the ecosystem is sufficiently unreliable and frustrating to use, people can just completely drop using your product altogether. So that's also a problem. So what we did with the ODM and also a bunch of other things like the Laravel extension is we reached out to the maintainer saying, like, we want to take maintenance fully in-house, and we dedicate a team of paid engineers who are working on it full-time, and they can do new releases with each new release of our products. We have very relatively quick turnaround on like bug fixes and other types of issues. And on top of that, it's still all open source, so people can still contribute to it. And we'll also have dedicated people to review PRs, so that's also great. They can still, submit issues and things like that, view source code. But you still have that advantage of the more reliable ecosystem. A nice life hack, if you're in a similar situation where you have this like a project that's kind of adjacent to your product and you want to take over maintenance, is you can reach out to the maintainer and maybe offer them a job, which is how my manager also got hired originally. Because, well, first of all, you save in recruitment costs, obviously, but they're also the perfect candidate because you already know that they have domain knowledge of your product, and they know exactly how this project is set up and designed because that's what they did. So coming back to the contributing to like the wider ecosystem, so not the things that we fully maintain ourselves and are responsible to. Like I said, we contribute to various other things in the broader PHP ecosystem that other people maintain. And a big reason for that is positioning. So if we see something happen in the community that aligns with how we want to position ourselves as a business, then we kind of assess how can we get involved? Is it worth it to get involved and things like that? And then if it's worth it, we get involved. So recently, like every other business right now, pretty much, we've wanted to position ourselves in the AI space, right? So recently, the way we want to position ourselves in the AI space is through, first of all, MongoDB Atlas as a vector search or a vector store. If you've seen Chris's talk, for instance, you'll know what that is. And then Voyage AI is our embedding model, pretty much. So we contributed to Symphony AI to support multimodal embeddings, which wasn't supported before we contributed it. And now you also, because it wasn't supported yet, we also were able to kind of shoehorn our own model into it as the first option if people do want to use multimodal embedding. So it's a really good opportunity to position yourself in that tool, basically. And then to Elephant, which is a non-framework specific Gen AI framework, we added MongoDB as a vector store because that wasn't supported at all yet. So it gives you kind of a presence. As a fun side bonus, I am now much more of an expert in Gen AI than I ever wanted to be. So I don't know. And not unimportantly, it also gives you the opportunity to write examples, usage documentation, tutorials for the things that you're contributing when they're released. Because if you do that, if you release, like if you add support for your product to a tool, and you add these examples and you add these this documentation and these tutorials, it lowers the barrier of entry for users to pick your solution as opposed to the other ones in the list of options, if that makes sense. Because if they can just copy over an example and implement something, then you're there. So of course, that brings us back to like the product ecosystem facilitates your users to use your products, right? But there's more to it than that. There's more advantages specifically to contributing to the broader ecosystem as opposed to just your own tools. So I kind of already mentioned it here, but when people start using new tools, like they look for Symfony AI, for instance, and they go through the documentation, and they see all the options for, in this case, for instance, supported vector stores, there is a limited amount of options to go through, right? And if you're not one of the options, people aren't going to pick you, or it's very unlikely, at least. They're going to go through this list and they're going to pick one of the options. Especially in this kind of discovery phase, if you're part of the options and you have these examples and tutorials and stuff, then you're really dramatically kind of increasing the odds of you being chosen. And once you're chosen, provided it matches their particular use case, once you're chosen, they're very unlikely to switch later. So if you're very present and visible in this early kind of discovery, exploration, learning phase, that's a massive opportunity to reel in long-term kind of loyal users, not just for this particular product that they're picking you for, but perhaps even when they move on to a different job or a different project, they might take you with them because you're now familiar to them, you're part of their skill set. They might even put it on their resume. So huge opportunity there to just be present early on in these spaces. Then there's also the fact that you're going to win. Thank you for appreciating the sound effects. You're going to win a lot of favor with maintainers, which is great, because you're making friends along the way, of course. But you're also, you're building with relationships with these maintainers. You're building together with these maintainers. This is us at the Doctrine Hackathon, because we're also part of the Doctrine core team because of the ODM. So again, it's very nice because friends and relationships and stuff. But as every speaker in this room will attest to, having direct lines to maintainers is very valuable because, you can just kind of have chats with them, ask questions, you can brainstorm together, you can build together, and you're making decisions together. So you have an influence on how the ecosystem is built and how it's designed, which again gives you an edge over your competition. So for instance, OpenAI, when they released their initial chat API, that basically became the blueprint for every other model and their API. So if you look at any other model, it's very likely that their endpoints and their data structures and stuff are, and their objects are literally copy pasted from the chat API because they were just the ones to make the blueprint, basically. So fostering relationships in the open source community provides decision-making power and influence over the ecosystem itself, which is also a very big benefit. So this is kind of, in summary, to me, the big whys of why and what you can tell the people with the money of why it's worth expending developer resources to write open source software. There's kind of a problem with these things, though, is that none of these things directly contribute to profitability, or to income, rather. And of course, usually with business people, you're usually not going to get buy-in from leadership based on just vibes, right? They always want to see like benchmarks and metrics and see the actual financial impact that you're making. And with these types of things, it's pretty hard to measure your impact and impossible to measure all of the impact actually. But you can definitely measure like a good portion of it if you're a little bit creative. So here's some of the things you can do to get that buy-in from these people who want to see the numbers. So first of all, you can take kind of like a marketing funnel approach. So like in marketing, you often have like a landing page and then like a call to action and then a conversion. So you can like kind of track that whole the whole funnel from like landing page to conversion. So you can kind of take that approach, but with documentation and tutorials. So you can track traffic to and from documentation and tutorials. And even if you can't track the exact moment of conversion, because it's documentation and tutorials, you already kind of can assume that the traffic coming to these things is pretty high intent. Because usually if people are already getting hands-on with tutorials, their intent is to really learn how to build with it. So that's a fairly good indicator, at least, even if you can't measure the actual conversion. Or you can even get a little bit more creative with these tutorials. Like for instance, if you have like a tutorial repository, you can make one of the setup steps like, fork this repository and then, or clone this repository, and then you can track that, or you can use like a default app prefix or a name or something like that, or an API test key, some sort of identifier that you can then track on your end for usage, so you know how many people are actually building your tutorial thing. So you can get a little bit creative. And coming back to fostering relationships in the open source community, it's also worth it to build these relationships, because you can ask maintainers like, hey, in this section about, well, in our case, databases, can you link to our documentation? And then often if there's like goodwill between you two, they might add that, and then that increases visibility first of all, but also you can track like referral traffic, right? So that's another way you can. So you got to kind of think a little bit outside of the box. And then there's usage statistics, of course. Like if you're building open source software, you might be publishing packages on Packagist. So you can track installs of your packages. If you're publishing a Docker image, you can go to Docker Hub and see the usage statistics there, like how many times this image has been pulled. And then, of course, there's GitHub, where you can see like the stars, the watches, the forks. But if you go to the Insights tab on GitHub, I didn't know this actually. So Rashab told me this because he's the metrics guy. So if you want more tips and tricks, sorry to throw you under the bus, but like flock to him. So the GitHub Insights tab has much more specific data, like clones, which you can't see I didn't know you could actually see how many clones a repo had. You can see like referral traffic and popular content on that repo. So things like, specific issues that people watch a lot, so that like, a lot of people are landing on this issue, for instance, because a lot of people are Googling the same problem that they're having or something like that. So you can kind of also have an indication of like what's important to your users. Then there's also a really interesting website that, again, Rashab pointed me at, which is OSS Insights without the S. Important, ossinsight.io, which has all sorts of useful data, stats, and like time series data about any repository. So you can put in any repository and it will give you all of this data, like, like location of contributors and stars, and how many clones over, and it'll have like time series, so you can track increases over time and stuff. So you can use that to make benchmarks to show that like, before we started doing this work, we were here, and then we started doing this work, and now we're here. So you can use that also to get buy-in of like, okay, we can't measure directly how much money is coming in from this, but you can definitely see that there's a much more of an upward trend in usage from these statistics. So now you kind of know why you would want to do this, and you know how to maybe tell leadership why you want to do this and show them the metrics. And I can hear you think that's cool and all, but like obviously you guys have an ecosystem because you're a database company and you're very developer focused, right? But like, how does this apply to my work? For me, I think like if I had to think about it, it could be anything that applies to you that improves your market positioning, that can potentially grow your user base through facilitation. So facilitating your users to use whatever product you're selling. So it doesn't have to be software, but something else potentially, or even anything that like streamlines processes so you can cut costs, like operational costs. Because even if you're not contributing to like an increased user base, if you can bring down costs, you're still adding to the profitability of your business, right? And then also anything that may improve relationships with partners and stakeholders could also be valuable. So like just to make it a little bit more tangible, like if you're a payment provider, you can maybe build an SDK or like some WordPress plugin so that app developers can more easily integrate with you as opposed to your competitors. If you're a pizza delivery company, you can like release an MCP server that so that agentic app developers can build a chatbot that orders pizza from your place specifically. I once worked for, my first PHP job actually was for an agency whose sole existence was because there was this big ERP software system that would sell the software to potential clients knowing full well that it didn't support their use case. So they would just call us and we'd write a bunch of like connectors and adapters and like data transformer type things. And then also pay us to maintain it over the years. And I just feel like if they would have done that in-house, they would have dedicated maybe 4 or 5 people to that. They could have saved so much money instead of paying us. I mean, I'm not complaining, but, and if you still kind of can't figure out how to apply this to your work, I would, first of all, I would love to hear your ideas, and I would love to kind of discuss it with you if you're having trouble. But I would also maybe look at the developer journey, which is like the journey that developers take when they choose a solution, right? And you can maybe apply that to your users or your market, whatever that is. So you can see, for instance, that like in the evaluation stage, right, you can contribute to that stage by publishing really good documentation. And so you can look at kind of each stage here and think, how does this apply to what I'm doing? So like in the adoption phase here, you see the ease of implementation, which is what I was talking about. Like if you facilitate them and if you make it convenient for people to use, then they'll be more likely to adopt it. So just kind of go through all the stages and consider like, how could I apply that to our company, basically. Now, if that's still not enough, I'm sorry, there's no solution. No, of course not. There's you could always quit your job and find a new one. Because there's lots, like if you want to work for FANG, I would personally not, but they of course have like a massive ecosystem, so they have many roles for open source people, but also a little closer down. Well, we of course have several teams dedicated specifically to writing open source, but also Laravel, Letio is like the company behind Symfony and some other things, Packages, Tideway, like there's, and of course the PHP Foundation. You can pay them, but you can also maybe get paid by them, or just contribute for free. Try not to get the evil eye.
These are all valid options.
These are all valid options. You heard it here first. So yeah, I hope that gave you a way to think about how you might get paid to write open source software, because it rules. So thank you. I would love any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Yeah, a few questions came in. One of the questions you actually answered whilst you were doing the talk, so well done for preempting that question. There is now discussion on Slack as to whether you are an AI bot. But another question came in. How would you rescue an abandoned OSS library where the maintainer doesn't reply?
I guess the only option there, if they really are not replying, the only option there would be to fork it and just say, okay, this is ours now. And then you could still pay people to maintain that fork.
There you go. Hostile takeover. Once again, you heard it here first. And given that you already answered the next question, the only remaining question is the most important question, apparently. What font are you using for the headers of your slides?
You gotta ask Canva. No, it is a Canva thing. I didn't design this myself. I'm not that good at it. But I'll drop it in the chat.
There you go. Follow Pauline on the socials or in the Slack chat, and you find out what font that is. So your slides too could look amazing. Can please give another round of applause to Pauline.